Welcome back. My name is Frank Perri, and we will be discussing the relationship of women to red-collar crime. Now, before I go into the nuances of women and their relationship to red-collar crime, I want to at least look at some of the similarities that women have to men and men have to women in terms of how they engage in red-collar crime. First of all, in terms of the weaponry, they both use, for example, guns or hard objects, things of that nature, and they also participate in murder for hire schemes. But there is a distinction that I have found with women, and one of them is that they are willing to resort to sedatives. Sedatives are things that we take in order to perhaps relax us, and this may be particularly of use to a woman in order to weaken their target before they kill them. In terms of personal traits, they share similar personal traits to the men. For example, you'll have those that are psychopathic, or they may be malignant narcissists. Moreover, a distinction that I have found with women is that they are more prone to engaging and participating in a kill team. What do I mean by that? Well, typically what you find with the men is that they do it individually, or that they'll hire somebody to do the killing for them. But with women, they may be participating in a kill team where, for example, they'll recruit another woman to help them. So you may have a female-female kill team, you may have a female-male kill team, and at times you'll have women who are mothers who are recruiting their sons in order to engage in the homicide. Let me go into some examples for you. Let's look at the case of Ernestina Bernal and Ernesto Barajas. These are two individuals who killed James and Sue Mahler. Now, Ernestina worked for what I could characterize as a mortgage company, and she was engaging in mortgage fraud. Now, she got the impression that the Mahlers were investigating her and for the fraud that she was committing, because the Mahlers got law enforcement involved. Once Ernestina found out about this, she recruited Ernesto Barajas. They went over to the Mahlers' residence, and they had them lay on the floor and killed them execution style with a gun. Let's move on to the case of Shantae and Kenny Kimes. Shantae and Kenny Kimes were a kill team. This was a mother-son kill team. Shantae has an incredible history of criminality in her background. And in fact, if my memory serves me correctly, she was one of the few people in the 20th century who went to prison for a crime that could be characterized as slavery. Now, in this case, she had a colleague by the name of David Kasdan. She went and engaged in mortgage fraud by engaging in identity theft of David Kasdan. David found out about it and confronted Shantae. Shantae threatened him and says, "You need to participate in this scheme," which was in the thousands of dollars, but in without David's authority. Once the conversation did not end on a good note, she told her son, Kenny, "He knows too much. Basically, we need to get rid of him." She sent Kenny to his house, who shot him in the head. He then, with a colleague, took the body and placed it in a dumpster. But what's really interesting is that on his way back home, he stopped by a florist shop and bought his mother flowers because, as he says, he had felt like he had done such a wonderful thing for his mother that he wanted to celebrate. Now, this is not the only homicide that they engaged in. They also killed a gentleman, a banker by the name of Syed Ahmed. And in this case, this is where the sedative came into play, where they gave him a sedative that weakened him, and then they took turns drowning him in a tub. And the last individual that they killed was an elderly woman by the name of Irene Silverman. Now, she lived in Manhattan, and she rented out her apartment complex. Now, Shantae had different ideas. She wanted to take over that apartment complex, and she engaged in identity theft and mortgage fraud. Eventually, they killed Irene. Now, in this case, there were observers of Shantae, forensic psychologists, psychiatric individuals who are professionals in the field, and they agreed that she displayed psychopathic traits of lack of remorse, callous behavior, unconscionable behaviors. The last individual that I would like to now introduce you to are two women. Rita Rutterschmidt and Helen Golay. Now, technically, these women don't represent red-collar crime, but I did introduce you to them for a reason. I wanted to debunk the myth that somehow, as people get older, they're not capable of engaging in heinous acts. These two women were in their mid to late 70s when they committed homicide. What was their scheme? Well, what they did was that they would go and recruit homeless men. They would give them food and shelter, but in exchange, what they would do is take out insurance policies under their names. Now, insurance policies had to be kept open for a significant period of time, typically about 2 years, in order not to raise suspicion that there was foul play. What did they do? Well, like cattle, like livestock, they would go and lock these men up and take out insurance policies for them. When the time period was ripe, they would give them sedatives, and then they would drive them to an undisclosed location, someplace that wasn't isolated. They would remove them from the cars, and then they would run them over back and forth, crushing their skull and their bodies to the point that these individuals died. Now, both Rita Rutterschmidt and Helen Golay were eventually found guilty of homicide. As you can see, just as men are capable of engaging in heinous acts, so are women. I want to thank you for taking the time out to listen to this lecture on women and its relationship to white-collar crime. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. Please stay tuned for our question and answer segment. I know that you'll find it thought-provoking and interesting.
Frank, have myths surrounding female aggression declined over time?
I think that the question of female aggression is a real interesting one. I do believe in my research that over time, the myth of female aggression has in fact declined. Well, first of all, what was the myth? I think the myth was that somehow female aggression, female violence was an anomaly, was something unusual. Now, women engage in violence for a variety of reasons and motives. At times, they may lash out violently because they've been abused. Absolutely, that does happen. But we also need to acknowledge that they, like men, may engage in violence for their own other motives. One of them may be fraud detection homicide. Some of them are serial killers. Now, how has it decreased over time and why? Well, I think that the myth has in fact been chipped away because of technology. In the past, when women engaged in horrific crimes, for example, homicide, we had print paper, we had newspapers, local papers that would print what happened. Perhaps it was known in the regional circles, maybe at the national level. So when something horrific happened, it seemed like it was like a one-off. It wasn't something that happened all the time, so we thought it was more of an anomaly. I think with, for example, just basically the internet, information is shared instantaneously. What happened in New York, we know instantaneously. In Los Angeles, California, what happened in other parts of the world, we know today in the United States instantaneously. So, for example, specifically with women, if they engage in some crime, we're going to know about it regardless of where it happened. So the frequency in which we see women engaging in aggressive acts is more frequent simply because the technology allows for that to happen.
In a lot of the cases we're hearing about, the women tend to seem like they take more manipulative approaches and defenses. Is this true?
That's an interesting insight, and let me explain how that would play itself out, for example, on a legal stage. Now, when we looked at, for example, Helen Golay and Rita Rutterschmidt, all right, these were elderly women. Part of the strategy for them to try to get off the hook was to present themselves, number one, as women who are not capable of engaging in horrific acts. Then on top of it, they try to take their age, couple that with being a woman, and say, look, we're no different than your grandma. Your grandma's a lovely woman. She loves her grandchildren. We would never do anything like that, just like your grandmother would never do anything like that. What are they doing? They're trying to feed into a stereotype. They're trying to feed into a stereotype that a potential juror might have about female aggression. So if a person might think, well, you know what, women are not capable of this, then you have these women projecting a certain image that feeds into that perception you have of female aggression. Perhaps in your mind might say, well, you know what, they're not guilty. So legally, that was the strategy that Rita and Olga were trying to use. They were trying to feed into an image that they're women and their age made them incapable of engaging in murder.
Thanks, Frank.